So we need to, and this is just sort of, this has to be a continuing practice. This has to be part of our political awareness. The idea that we make sure that we're not misunderstanding what people say, especially if we're trying to throw them in jail.
Hello, and welcome back to Tomato Tomato. I'm your host, Talia Sherman, as always, and I'm thrilled today to bring you part one of my conversation with Alex Walker, the current Rappaport Fellow at Harvard Law School. Now, he's not here because this is a new podcast about law or anything like that, but because of his work at the intersection of language, linguistics, and law. In part one, we're going to talk about his work on problems that you've probably heard about before. Things like linguistic prejudice and discrimination and sociolinguistic justice. But the key difference here is that Alex looks at these linguistic problems in the legal system with the goal of addressing them through policy and other legal frameworks. And to support his ideas for a more just legal system, he brings in economic theory, philosophy, and history, and legal precedents, rather than structural linguistic theories or arguments about semiotics, etc., etc., etc. Now, of course, Alex can absolutely discuss linguistic theory and use it to make claims about legal frameworks or political philosophy or the practice of law. These things go both ways, but that's all coming in part two. For now, a more pragmatic discussion, in all senses of that word, with the enviably articulate and well-read Alex Walker. Alex Walker, welcome to the podcast. I'm so happy to be here with you today.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. So to start, as always, please introduce yourself. Tell the world who you are, what you are doing right now, why you're doing it, what's going on.
Sure. So as you said, I'm Alex Walker. I'm the Rappaport Fellow at Harvard Law School. And basically what I do is sort of legal research at the intersection of linguistics. So I look at things like languages, dialects, and how, and due process and economics and all sorts of different issues about how language affects, the way we should think and the way legal issues do play out in practice sometimes. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah, that's your story. And I'm personally interested in the chronology of it. So you went to Columbia for undergrad, right, and you studied linguistics along with economics, political science, and then you go to law school. So was it always the plan to go to law school? Did you stumble upon linguistics?
So almost the reverse. So absolutely not. It was not always the plan to go to law school. So I finished Columbia, and I finished a little early, and so I had no idea what I was doing, and I didn't know what I was going to do. So I went back home to Atlanta, where I'm from, and I taught high school Spanish for a short stint. And then during that period, I saw some things in the legal system, sort of the normal, got a little bit more awareness of sort of the criminal system and these sorts of things. And I realized I know nothing about how the law works. And that's a really interesting area that I've not interacted with. But during my undergrad, sort of linguistics was my intellectual baby. It's the thing I really love to do. And I sort of found law school after having graduated from undergrad and decided, why don't I give it a shot? And so then I went to law school, and then in law school, I saw, there's all these interactions with linguistics that I didn't realize were a thing really before I ended up at law school, and my classes on legislation and regulation, how do we interpret statutes, that sort of thing. But then I also realized later in my law school career that sort of this dialect question, which has sort of been the thing I've been really wrestling with, was not something that people had been thinking about much at all. A couple people had, but not at the granular level.
Yeah. So you're unusual. So thank you for pointing that out.
That's one way to put it.
Yes,
thanks.
You are certainly doing pioneering work. And the work that you're doing, so from my perspective, it's plenty of sociolinguists and people that consider themselves purely linguists are doing work on how certain dialects are stigmatized or systematically discriminated against in our legal system. But the approach that you take, which is sort of from the legal perspective, looking at how the legal system discriminates against these voices. So Walk us through that. So what's going on here? There's this problem of linguistic mismatch. There's this absence of what you call dialectal due process.
Right.
In this one paper, you had this brilliant line, which is, what is the value of my relationship with the government that won't talk to me in a language that I understand? Right? What is the value? So what's going on here? How are certain dialects systematically discriminated against?
Right. So I think there's two situations. One is someone speaking another language purely, right? Someone comes into the court system and they're speaking Mandarin or Navajo or what have you, right? And the judge, the jury, everyone around sort of understands this person is not speaking a language that I understand and that we can actually interact with. And in that situation, the legal system tries, and there's a framework in place to get translators and to do that sort of thing, right? And that causes problems because we don't do a good enough job at that, right? And we do a better job for some languages than others. Like at the border, we do a decent job, not a great one, but there is a process in place sort of for like Spanish translation at the border for immigration stuff, right? But then how do we deal with like people that come in who really only speak Spanish as their second language, and really they speak a Mayan language as their first language, and we don't actually have like a good system for that in place, right? So that's one issue, and that's like sort of the language mismatch situation. It's like when we look at the immigration system, we say, oh my goodness, most of the people coming in through it, right, are speaking Spanish, but we still do the processes in English, right? So maybe it would make sense actually to do those processes in Spanish. Like we don't have a federal, national language, but we still do those things in English. That's sort of like the full language mismatch situation. The other end of the spectrum is when you're thinking about a dialect where someone doesn't actually realize that someone's speaking with different structures. I'm sure your listenership knows very well. Look, there are differences between Black English, Appalachian English, Standard American English, British English, yada, yada, yada. But lots of lawyers and lots of legal actors don't really know this. And so they don't know that they don't know. And in those situations, you end up with mistranscriptions and misinterpretations of what either a litigant, so like your defendant, your plaintiff, or whatever has said, or even just a witness, right? What the witness has said. And then the witness might not be in court to say, no, that's not what I meant. This is what I meant, right? Maybe no one actually, as that's a party to the case, really knows initially what was said or what the dialect was, but that still could be misinterpreted. And so we have an issue of like not recognizing that a dialect is another full structure of language and not just slang that can be interpreted on the fly. And when that happens, we really don't have good procedures in place. And we can get more into the specifics of like sort of the research I've done on Black English if you want to, but that's sort of the broad problem. It's that we have languages on one hand, and we can do better about doing translation and transcription good with full other languages. But when you're speaking a dialect, it's not like there's a translator that you go and get. It's just people just sort of do it ad hoc, and that can cause problems in and of itself.
Yeah, and I think some part of that problem inevitably ends up being that people assume that they do understand,
right?
Because it's
exactly
somewhat recognizable.
Exactly.
So, for example, someone saying. You're going to say this a lot better than I'm going to say it, but like someone says lawyer dog, or
yes.
someone says trying to get a glick, right?
Right.
That comes across as something that someone can interpret and say like, oh, I understand that, even though they might not. And even when it is problems of linguistic mismatch, even if someone is relatively aware of Spanish or like knows something about Spanish, someone saying like, oh, like embarazada is not going to understand. That does not mean embarrassed. It means pregnant. So these are some things where that can go awry. Yeah, can you give us like one or two anecdotes of like where certain features of Black English are misinterpreted?
Sure. So I think you gave like the two like the examples that I think that are sort of like celebrated, maybe infamous is the right word, in the legal system.
Yeah.
One was under Miranda, if you are not provided a lawyer when you ask for one before sort of giving a statement to the police, then that statement can't be admitted into evidence, right? So that's the basic legal framework we're working under. And so basically there was this Black man in Louisiana, and the police come up to him and they say, we'd like to interview you. We want to get your statement. And he says something like, I know I didn't do it, but if y'all think I did it, why don't you just give me a lawyer dog? Because this is not what's up, right? That's basically exactly what he said. And then the police don't give him a lawyer. They interview him. In the subsequent interrogation, he confesses. This gets all the way up to the Louisiana Supreme Court, and basically the man's lawyer is arguing, look, he asked for a lawyer and they didn't give him one, so the confession cannot come into evidence. And Louisiana Supreme Court says, well, he didn't clearly ask for a lawyer. We don't know. He made an equivocal reference to a lawyer dog, and what that means, we don't know. And so because of that, it's not a clear ask for a lawyer. So he doesn't. The confessions can still come in. Right. So that's a clear example that I think even people who aren't like familiar with the details and the nitty gritty of Black English can sort of get. Like, as we know, if he said like lawyer dude or lawyer sir, like, can you give me a lawyer, sir? Like that, there is no way that
there's a comma.
Right. There's a comma. Right. And this is the other thing that I think is sort of not that is less known about this case is that it was the prosecution, right, who transcribed his statement. And they did not put a comma between lawyer and dog. Right. So you can imagine that if it was the defense that had transcribed it or some sort of third party that had transcribed it and put lawyer, comma, dog, and they spelled dog D-O-G, maybe if they had spelled it D-A-W-G or something, right? Would that have changed the outcome in the case? And so that's sort of also why I'm interested in transcription. And the other case you gave was, and this is slightly more complicated with respect to like evidence law, but the basic framework is, so the case was this man, he wasn't, because of his previous convictions, he's not allowed to attempt to get a gun, right? That's basically how the law applies to him. And in a Facebook message, someone says, "You're trying to get a glick," and he says, "Yeah." And the court says, this is evidence that he attempted to get a gun, right? But trying to in Black English doesn't mean trying to necessarily. It can just mean I want to, right? So in theory, the conversation could have gone and been totally consistent with what happened. You trying to get a glick? Yeah, I really want one. Yeah, I really want one and everything, but I can't get one because the law doesn't apply to me. So I'm definitely not trying to get one, right? But the court said, no, this is evidence that he attempted to get a gun, right? And they're just looking at the transcript themselves, and they might not know, right, that this is, that this has a particular meaning that could be different from standard English. But those are sort of two examples where it's like really like where there's been misinterpreted. And I guess the third example that I'll give is the Finna case. So there was a case where, the question was, does this woman's testimony come in as an excited utterance? But basically, long story short, it depends on whether the statement is in the present or past tense, and in the not past tense. And she said, "He finna shoot me," and the dissent, but really the majority agreed, saying, well, if there's no auxiliary verb, if it's not "he is finna shoot me" or "he was finna shoot me," that means it could be either, in which case it can't come in. But we know that in Black English, if you have an auxiliary verb, it can only be dropped in the present tense. So if it was in the past tense, there would have had to have been an auxiliary verb. So we know that it has to be "he," in parentheses, "is finna shoot me." But the court gets this wrong and therefore says that this should not be able to come in, basically. So those are the sort of instances where really just like differences in grammar, right? Differences in the grammar between Black English and standard English are causing courts to make mistakes, right?
Yeah, great examples. So then let's talk about like what we can do. You have covered this extensively in your work on what are the steps that we can take to both recognize and remediate these issues in our legal system. So yeah, walk us through what must be done.
So this is part of the nature of policy work and trying to figure out what should be done, what can be done, right? Because so there's a linguistic answers, right? Which is to say, it's like, how do I prevent this linguistic misinterpretation from happening, right? So this could happen by, training transcribers on, different dialects. I'm currently doing some research where I found, the transcribers at private transcription companies, and previous research has looked at court transcribers, and it seems like they make lots and lots of mistakes when it comes to Black English, right? So we could train them on Black English. We could train AI on Black English to become better transcribers, right? There are like dignitary concerns with that we can talk about later as well. But there's a linguistic problem, and we could get translators, right, for Black English for Black English speakers or dialect speakers, or we could. There's lots of things we could do in that respect. We could say, we could have courts say when juries are interpreting, as you know from the sociolinguistics that people have, that they stigmatize, non-standard dialects. You could have the court say before a jury hears some witness who's going to speak in Black English, hey, this person speaks in Black English. That doesn't mean they're stupid. You should really take what they're saying seriously. And you need to like basically like having the court basically tell the jury to like check their prejudice in the same way that they might say to, check their prejudice in other contexts. It's something called it's called a cautionary instruction, which we have already, but we just don't do it with respect to dialect, right? And all those things could happen. And I think those things would be good. With respect to transcriber training and translation, that might be very expensive. And so there's a question of how much political will there is. I think there's probably not much political will for a lot of this, to be frank. And when it comes to, some of the arguments I've made with respect to dialectal due process, right? Like if it's actually the case that transcribers are much worse at Black English, right? And so basically every Black litigant who's coming into court and has their stuff transcribed, and that transcription becomes what the appellate court is relying on, right? That might mean, if this was happening with, regular transcription, like if regular transcription with standard English was this error prone, I suspect that there would be, a pretty bad outcry in terms of, how much we need to basically slow down the criminal system, right? I don't suspect that will happen with respect to Black English because of just the way that, the machine churns, and being a little bit of a political realist here. But as far as the constitutional argument takes you, it would be something like you need to have someone who has, to solve the linguistic problem, you need to have someone look over the transcript and read and listen to the audio who has been trained and is competent in Black English, right? And I think that's unlikely to happen, and it would be expensive, but it would be what is necessary to make, the Black English transcription and the Black English, like the due process for Black English speakers, up to the same level as the due process of standard American speakers. And that's probably not going to happen, but it's what sort of the constitutional argument would lead you to think if you buy it. But I think really what the issue is that we like to go all the way to the first order. It's like we have a incarceration problem in the first instance. We have so many people coming through the system. If the issue things are gonna break when you have so many people coming through so fast, right? It's just very hard to do these things in a proper manner, and that's part of the issue, and especially because Black English isn't like a region. It's not like a regional dialect in the United States in the same way, right? It's in every urban center in the nation, right? If it was just in Georgia, then we could just concentrate all our efforts in Georgia and then bring someone from Georgia whenever we need it somewhere else because someone has moved. But because of the particular history of Black English and the Great Migration and its geographic dispersion, and relatively recently in linguistic time, it's just not the case that we have such regional concentration. And so I worry that we won't really solve the problem unless we solve a lot of other bigger problems in the law, which is an unfortunate thing to say, but I think that might be the case. But there are things we could do at the margins to get transcription better and to get better situations better outcomes when we know that Black English is involved.
Yeah. And I guess to pick up on a couple things, right, there is this tension of like, yes, if it weren't the case that Black people are so overrepresented in our courts,
right,
like maybe this wouldn't be so much of an issue. But that is an issue,
right?
And so it takes like a lot of dismantling of systemic racism to get to a place where things are like more equitable, even in a world where like the very fact that we're like going to courts and how this process is quite fraught. So yeah, there's a lot going on there. And I like what you said also about like how geographically dispersed this dialect is, but also how much cohesion there is even across geography.
And that's sort of a lucky thing. Like, I mean, it would be because the problem is like when we have sort of these like cultural separations in a way that create like linguistic enclaves and exclaves in the United States due to sort of the history of slavery and then the Great Migration and all of that. Like we have this sort of weird linguistic situation that's like rare at the global sense. Like really linguistically diverse countries like India, for example, you still have like regional concentration, and there's still like exclaves, like you have like the random, not random, but the like the remaining Dravidian language up in the north, right? That is surrounded by the Indo-European. But it's still the case that they're still regionally concentrated in a way that Black English isn't. And so you can have regional languages that work pretty well in India, and that's not to say that their legal system is perfect. They have issues where like they still use a lot of English when very little of the population speaks English. But there's not I'm not sure there's a good analog to the United States with respect to its dialects in other countries, which is an interesting situation to be in. I want to do more research on Brazil because of its large, formerly enslaved population, and whether there are, what the dialect situation is between different people of different racial makeups in the Brazilian context. But also there was there was a much more prominent mixed population in Brazilian history than there was in United States history, and so maybe that means that there's more of a dialect continuum in some sense, but I'm not sure. And so you'd have to talk to a Brazilian expert, but that's something I'm really interested in and looking forward. Is there an analog to the United States linguistic situation?
Yeah, you mentioned in one paper about like the European Union having 24,
right?
What is it, like legal national language?
Official languages.
24 official languages, right? And how for every single legal proceeding, for like everything, there has to be translation and transcription in every single one of these 24.
Right. And something that has legal effect, it has to have translation. I'm not sure this is the case for like court proceedings, right, that aren't at the EU level, right? Because it's the difference because the thing is, right, the EU, it's not one country. And so you have, like Hungary will have its own laws written in Hungarian. Those aren't necessarily being translated into French, but everything that has like full application to the entire union does need to be translated into all those things, and they all have equal force, right? We could imagine the United States having, translations into Spanish and those having equal force at the national level. We could imagine that, right? Actually, in the 19th century, California had laws that were passed both in Spanish and in English, and their constitution was translated into Spanish. And so there's precedent for this sort of thing. But
and the Constitution wasn't the Constitution originally translated
yes, the
into
Constitution,
Dutch?
exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
The Constitution was originally, our Constitution too, the federal Constitution was translated originally into also Dutch and German. And whether or not that has, there's sort of all sorts of weird linguistic legal arguments about, originalism and textualism and these things and what those mean. But so different people think those translations have different value in terms of interpreting how the Constitution applied today. But it is the case that we have sort of this lost past of linguistic diversity and sort of recognized linguistic diversity that's less recognized today.
Yeah, I thought it was a little bit funny. In one of your papers, you wrote like the EU has all these translation services, period. This isn't costless, period. It costs 0.2% of the budget. Yes. And I was like, 0.2%? That does not seem like that much to me. I feel like we could swing that. But the reality is maybe 0.2% matters a lot. Because you also did this great study on transcription services, as you mentioned before, comparing different transcription services and saying, look, they make a lot of errors, but so do the humans.
Yes.
The humans are making just as many errors as the AI in terms of transcribing Black English correctly. And that was astonishing to me. But it's like 0.2% to solve all of that.
Well, not to solve it, right? To get official,
to get better
translation, yeah. Right? And I think there's two things going on here. One is, again, the EU isn't one country, and so you could also look at like how many pages of things need to be transcribed or translated or something like that, right? But assuming it's on the same order of magnitude, like they have of the same order of magnitude of the population of the EU, right? In the United States, that would we could translate into more languages, and I do think we should probably translate things if we actually think that like fair notice is something that we care about in the law. Like someone should be able to read the law that applies to them and know that it applies. There should at least be some like official translation or a way to get an official translation of the law into Spanish. That seems like a no-brainer to me. If you do care about fair notice, if you think that that's not really what's going on here, right, and that's more of a legal argument, then maybe you don't need translation. But it also isn't. But then it could be the case that you wrote it in like Hittite. It wouldn't really matter what language you wrote it in if you don't think that the people need to be able to read it, right? But if you think the people do need to be able to read it, then it would make a lot of sense because of how many Spanish speakers, especially, right? And we could talk about other languages below that. I think you would probably go further than Spanish, but when it's you would think it needs to be translated into Spanish. And then when we're talking about the AI and the AI transcription, yes. So I've done my like sort of pilot study on this, and I found that like sort of you get 200% or about 300% the errors when you change from standard English to Black English when you send a transcription, like something to be transcribed to these private transcription companies, which are relied upon in the legal system and at many junctures. And then the question is sort of how much of a good estimate is this? Is it actually of how like a real transcription that would happen in a court system? And there's two things. First, so this transcription that I gave them was as easy as I could make it in some senses, because it was one person, right? So I had one individual read the transcript, and it was good audio quality, basically. So you have a monologue, right? That's like the best, and you can listen to it as many times as you like.
Yeah.
Right. So you have a monologue that you can listen to over and over and over again, and you're still getting all these errors, right? And as you mentioned, there was no statistical difference between AI transcribers and human transcribers, which makes you think, okay, it would be a lot cheaper to use the AI, so maybe we should just use the AI, right? But then there's a couple issues with that, I think. First is because it was so easy, maybe that's why the AI did so well. Maybe if the audio quality went down and it was multiple people speaking at the same time, the humans would get worse, yes, but the AI would get a lot worse, right? And so we don't know if it's actually the case that with bad audio quality that the AI does match the humans, right? So that's one issue, right? And the other thing is, does that mean that we would get, AI transcribers for people who speak dialects, but then human transcribers for people who speak standard English? And then what does that look like with respect to, first and second class citizenship? And whether or not, the outcome is better or the same or whatever, right? People are going to feel a certain type of way when you go in. Like imagine a situation where Black English speaking witnesses have to speak to a translator, right? That's going to causes something, right? That people will feel a certain type of way about that, even if it would cause like the linguistic data to be transmitted better. That's going to cause, consternation and feelings of second class citizenship that we need to take seriously, right? And, maybe if we could, perfectly educate everyone, it's like, oh no, we're not doing that for this reason. But there's good reason for people to think that that's maybe not the only reason that this is happening. You think I don't speak English, yada, 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 yada. And so there's lots of things to think about with respect to integrating these procedures that would get the linguistic data transmitted better. whether that's human translators, AI, whatever, but that would, that run into our social reality in a way that we need to think about seriously before we sort of make these technocratic solutions that people on the ground might not fully understand or be on board with. Yeah.
Yeah. I found that really interesting in the study. It's the best quality that one could have, and yet it's still messing up. Right. That was remarkable, because the reality is that you're never going to get the evidence in an audio file like that that's just a monologue with no background noise and nothing. Like it's like such a contrived, perfectly construed thing. So it's remarkable, honestly, that there was so many errors. And even in a world where like you would think that people who don't even speak African American English or Black English are relatively familiar with it.
You would think, yes. But I think
you would think.
But I think there's also an age divide here to the extreme, right? I think for some people, like us people that are over the age of 50, for example, which many transcribers maybe are, right? The nationalized culture that we have today in hip hop, in movies, in entertainment, right?
Yeah.
Was not yet there. Whereas, now we have, people saying that, the whole TikTok speak or Gen Z slang is, a lot of times just Black English, right? Oftentimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's a sense in which there is more familiarity, maybe not like perfect familiarity, right? Like I see like habitual B being misused all the time. So it doesn't mean that people really understand it, but there is more familiarity, I think, with the younger generation with Black English because of, sort of the cultural cachet that it's gained in the past, let's call it 40 years, right? With, and especially the last 30 with rap music. And so that's caused more familiarity in the younger generation in a way that's not with the older generation. And the legal profession trends older. So it might be the case that some of these issues might be alleviated with time. I'm hesitant to say that, but it would be nice if some of them did. I think at least the recognition of it as a dialect is much more understood in the younger generation than the older generation. But whether or not these things are cyclical and it'll flip back the other direction, that's unclear.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay, yeah, a couple of things there. So there's this cultural cachet associated with Black English, and it's in rap songs and things like that. I still think, though, that like something that I have been asked to think about recently is like the difference between standard Black English and non-standard Black English, and how much people are aware of certain perhaps phonological features of Black English, but not necessarily the morphosyntactic grammar of this dialect or language. So that is also something, because someone might recognize trying to get a glick as Black English, but we understand that there's an actual different semantic meaning. So that is, or where you can delete the auxiliary verb.
Right.
And the only reason I know this is because I had to take a quiz on the grammar of Black English.
You did? Okay.
Yes, I did.
So this is actually something that I'm very interested in, because we don't really have sort of standardized tests for Black English in a way that could assess the competency of transcribers. And so one thing I am thinking about is sort of creating a battery that would test.
Yeah.
Like sort of what do I give to a transcriber to test them to know that they are able to understand Black English? And I think these materials do need to be created. I know there's like these smaller things that happen in sort of like in linguistics classrooms across the nation.
Yeah.
But some sort of like broader standard, I think is important.
So we covered like what we can do and what would be helpful, ridiculously helpful if we did do legally. But then let's talk about the sort of moral, philosophical precedents for this and the historical precedents. There's a lot of literature written for years and years and years that you pull from to speak about what's going on here morally. So yeah, take it away.
Right. So I think there's a couple moral things, right? The first is sort of just the regular consent of the governed, and the idea that if I'm going to have a law applied against me, I should have a way of understanding what that law is. So the idea is, if I speak Spanish and the whole entire system of government works in English, I should have some way of reasonably coming about to understand what that legal system is, right? And in some ways, there's the intuition that, some things are just sort of culturally people are aware of. Most people, you don't need to be told that murder is illegal, right? Yeah. Or like just killing people for no reason is illegal, right? So maybe we're okay with that. When we're talking about like sort of regulations, taxes, what positive rights I have, like what does Social Security Administration owe me, that sort of thing, right? We need to think pretty hard about sort of what it means to give a person fair notice of the law that applies to them, right? And I think we don't do a great job of that right now with respect to the administrative state and with respect to even some criminal laws and like housing laws and these sorts of things. And there's work that's being done to make sure that people understand those in translation. And I think the place where we sort of think about it the most is voting, and where we have sort of like actually like minority language rights with respect to voting. But that's one of the only places that we have like sort of this giant statute, Voting Rights Act, that says, hey, here are the places where you have to make sure that minority languages are understood. With respect to like sort of more formal like economics arguments, right, and these sorts of things, I think there's a pretty strong case that certain things should be done in other languages. Like certain proceedings should happen in Spanish, in Mandarin, those sorts of things, especially in immigration. Like if you just think about the idea that, and then you can sort of think of a very simple model, but the model would look something like this. Like everyone who comes into the court, right, they're doing it and they're going to get some benefit from it, right? They go to court, they get some benefit, right? And you imagine if you go to court on Mars, we're all speaking Martian, there's no way if you understand them, right? Or then they understand you, you're not going to get any benefit, yeah. Right? Because there's no way for you to understand each other. Similarly, even when we do things in translation, the mismatch causes some slippage. And so if I go to court in English, there's some slippage, right? But if I go to court in Spanish, where the proceeding happens in English, there's more slippage, right? So if we think, well, we want to reduce the total amount of slippage in some sense, you should probably have court in the language that's most common. So when we look at the border and at immigration, so the vast majority of people are speaking Spanish when they come in, right? And so the idea that we're just allowing so much slippage by having judges that don't necessarily speak Spanish and lawyers who don't necessarily speak Spanish. So if the idea is we want to actually reduce the amount of slippage and sort of have the most social welfare come out of it, we probably want to make sure that we probably want to be able to have proceedings in Spanish. And if we can do it in both, great. But in terms of it makes sense, to have court usually in the United States in English, because that's what most people speak. But the idea that immigration court, well, most people don't speak English coming into immigration court in many places. So by the same logic, you should do it in Spanish, right? But just pure social welfare sort of economic arguments, right? And maybe you'd say, well, it'd be very hard to find judges that speak Spanish. I would say, probably not, but that's sort of a different discussion. But that's also a fixed cost as soon as you've invested in training Spanish-speaking lawyers, of which we have a lot, especially considering the fact that we have a whole legal system as part of the U.S. that operates in Spanish in Puerto Rico. There's plenty of judges that are perfectly eligible to become immigration judges, and you could use them to run the immigration system. And that's before you even think about all the different rules with respect to asylum and immigration that sort of are a little bit linguistically discriminatory. But in terms of what language should the proceedings happen in, when you have a lot of people speaking in a different language, you would suspect, hey, maybe we should do it in that language. And the same is true with respect to certain criminal courts in the United States, in certain areas where the judge might be speaking standard English, but most of the people coming through the court. I did a clinic in law school where it was a family court with respect to child separation. I think there was one white client over the course of the semester, right? And the vast majority of people coming in were speaking Black English. So wouldn't it make sense for the judge in that context to have some familiarity with Black English? Shouldn't the proceeding not necessarily happen fully in Black English, because then you have to translate that for the appellate court, but the idea that, you shouldn't have proceedings where people understand the language at hand, it makes sense. On pure, just economic Paradianism, what causes the greatest good for the greatest number sort of rationale. And then you have even, these, and then if that's not your cup of tea, the idea of, dignity and the idea of, who, what are we telling people when we don't recognize their languages, when we don't speak to them in the language that they understand? And what does that mean for dignitary concerns? What does that mean for sort of the community that we're building and democracy, right? If we want to say, well, we don't just mean, one of the justifications for freedom of speech is the marketplace of ideas. You need more ideas around that, the best one will win out. So sort of Darwinian sense. There's also this idea of, well, if we're going to have actually people participate, we do need to make sure that people aren't, shouted out of the system, right? We need to make sure that we are actively encouraging people to come into the system to get their ideas. Because otherwise, if you're in a situation where, the environment is very sexist or something, there's lots of sexist jokes running around, right? The women are going to be less likely to participate, but you need their ideas if you want the marketplace to function efficiently. And similarly, if we're thinking in our democracy, we have a ton of Spanish speakers. We have a ton of speakers of different dialects. If we're just discounting what they say because of the language that they're speaking and not bringing them in actively, right? We're losing possible data to come to the best of all possible worlds and the good life and all these sorts of other things that people love to talk about. but there's lots of there's community reasons, there's economic reasons, there's dignitary reasons. There's just normal, human respect reasons, like interpersonal respect reasons that I think that makes sense to think about more translation with respect to both more respect and translation with respect to dialect and respect to language. And I think all of those things are good reasons to think really, really hard about, the way that we run things and not just go, well, this is sort of the way it's been done. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Brilliant answer. Just from a multidisciplinary standpoint, that was flawless. I want to pick up on one thing, which is one line in one of your papers on this, like, I believe it's pronounced Ubuntu.
Ubuntu, yes.
Yes, Ubuntu-based capability approach, which calls into question this idea that when you don't understand someone, it's much easier to, quote, just not care about them. And so for me, it's like, that's key, right? When you just don't get it, you have no reason to care about them. So when we can understand each other, that affirms humanity, and we become more human ourselves and ride off into the sunset. I mean, it's more complicated than that, exactly. but like that is certainly a part of it. So like definitely throughout your writing have like just, I don't know, like seen traces of all these philosophers, but then also, I saw there was some line in something you wrote, like Toni Morrison's like Playing in the Dark was jumping out at me. I was like, yes, like,
yes.
Like when you create categories of whiteness based on like what is not Black, like that
yes.
is so Toni Morrison coded. So yeah. Oh, because you wrote a thing on like Blue Book citations.
Yes, I did. Yeah. I did write a thing on Blue Book citations. There's a degree to which, and it was funny because there was sort of like a small like conservative reaction to what I wrote online on Twitter. But it was kind of funny reading it. But yes, I did write a thing on, Blue Book citations and the idea of like, respect and what it means to like respect someone and respect like sort of the meta norms of our society. But I think part of that is also like sort of this idea of Ubuntu that I've been playing around with, which it comes out of Africa and South Africa especially, where it's been developed. And the idea that, what makes us human, we are human through other people in some sense. And I think language is key to that, because language is how we communicate to other people, whether it's, signed, whistled, spoken, touch, whatever. It's very hard to be a human when you haven't, when you've been deprived of language in some way, right? When, the people that have been, when they're locked up for long periods of time and they're unable to like develop language, it's hard to be a human like that. And that's one of like the most tragic things that can happen to a person. And the importance of language and being able to communicate with other people is key. And I think that is part of, and it is one of the things, going back to, Aristotle and like how we define ourselves as a species, right? Is sort of through this like linguistic faculty often, whether that's right or wrong. It's part of sort of how we think about society and how we think about each other. And that's a really good reason to think that language should be really respected in any sort of political system.
Yeah, maybe it's a little upsetting, maybe it's a little disappointing, but it is great that you are finally bringing attention to like this intersection of linguistics and law, because I think that a lot of the work that I've seen in the past is like philosophy of language and the law and like the meaning of counterfactuals, the meaning of conditionals and like modal logic. This is, well, I don't want to make a value judgment, but I just feel like this is so important, right? This has to be so important, because to the people that the law actually affects, your research will pertain to, and rather than like the people who interpret this law.
That's the hope.
Yeah, exactly. Yes.
And my piece that's going to be coming out in California Law Review probably early 2025. That's the explicit goal. It's like, look, lawyers, here's the features of Black English you need to know in order to serve your clients properly, right? And I think that's basically that's the crux of it. And that needs to happen for basically all the dialects. I can do Black English because that's what I grew up speaking, and it's quick for me to write such a thing. But I'm thinking a lot about indigenous languages and indigenous Englishes and that sort of thing as well. When we're like in Alaska, in Hawaii, and it worries me because I've not studied what the situation is in those areas. We have the luck of them being more regionally confined, but there still needs to be a lot of work to make sure that all dialects are given the attention they deserve, and the idea that and that this is a continuing practice, because as we know, one of the first things you learn is all languages change in all respects at all times, and so so we need to, and this is just sort of, this has to be a continuing practice. This has to be part of our political awareness. The idea that we make sure that we're not misunderstanding what people say, especially if we're trying to throw them in jail.
Thanks so much for listening to part 1 of Tomato Tomato. Coming up in part 2, we have a bit more of a theoretical discussion. how do we apply linguistic theories and methods salutarily to legal systems, to law scholarship?
Yeah, so there's sort of two things going on here, right? A lot of sort of that philosophy of language stuff that you were talking about before is sort of trying to say, okay, what does this word mean? Like that's basically what that's their project.
Plus, a conversation about AI and law. When and in what contexts, and more importantly, why would you want a robot judge?
And I think right now a lot of the debate, especially amongst lawyers who aren't like computer literate, is something like, well, the AI can never be better than the human, right? In this particular way. And it's like, well, you could always design an AI, right? In theory, with enough computing power that would get the outcome, right? If all you care about is just the outcome, how the rules apply, you can make the AI do it.
And of course, how many languages does he speak?
Like when I first went to college, I had no idea what linguistics was, right? I knew a couple languages by then, just by, happenstance.
You knew many. Wait. No. Your CV is so impressive. Please tell people. You know many. You know many languages. Please.
So we got English, Spanish.
All that, plus a discussion of how optimality theory, a method and theory of phonology, can be applied to law. Inevitably, abortion comes in there, Roe v. Wade, favorite linguistics facts, stare decisis, precedents, political philosophy, all things we love. It's gonna be great. I'll see you there.